It was supposed to be a harmless adventure. Lisa, Max, and Julia, three college friends with a shared love for thrill-seeking, had planned their New Year's Eve celebration to be unlike any other. Instead of heading to the usual parties or fireworks displays, they set their sights on an abandoned mansion a few miles out of town. The mansion, as local legend had it, hosted a mysterious New Year's party every 10 years. According to the stories, guests who attended this party were never seen again. The trio's goal was clear: capture paranormal activity for their social media channel and gain some notoriety. Lisa, the self-proclaimed leader of their little group, had researched the mansion's history. "It's called the Grayson Estate," she explained as they loaded their car with cameras and flashlights. "Built in the 1920s by a weird thing started happening there. It's been abandoned ever since." "Weird things like what?" Max asked, his tone more curious than concerned. Lisa grinned. "The usual. Ghost sightings, strange music, people disappearing. It'll make for great content." Julia, the most cautious of the group, didn't share Lisa's enthusiasm. "I don't know, guys. This sounds intense. What if the stories are true?" "That's what makes it fun," Lisa replied, her excitement unshaken. "Besides, it's just one night. What could go wrong?" The Grayson Estate was as eerie as the photos had shown. The massive ivy-covered structure loomed over them as they pulled up the long snow-covered driveway. Broken windows and a sagging roof gave the impression that the house was barely holding itself together. The air was bitterly cold, and the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the snow. "This place gives me the creeps," Julia muttered, as they stood before the rusted iron gate. Max shrugged. "It's just a house." But as they approached the front door, they heard something faint. Music. It was soft and distant, like a record playing in another room. Julia stopped in her tracks. "Do you guys hear that?" Lisa frowned. "Yeah, weird. Maybe it's the wind or something," exhaled. The explanation didn't sit well with Julia, but she followed them to the doorstep. There they found an envelope resting on the cracked stone. The paper was pristine, as if untouched by the elements. Lisa picked it up and opened it, revealing a beautifully engraved invitation. "To our esteemed guests," she read aloud, "you are cordially invited to the Grayson Estate's New Year's Eve Gala. Please join us for an unforgettable evening." Max laughed nervously. "Okay, that's weird. Who's still hosting parties here?" Lisa tucked the invitation into her pocket. "Let's find out." The mansion's interior was a stark contrast to its exterior. Instead of dust and decay, they were met with opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over polished marble floors. Grand staircases spiraled upward, and the scent of roses filled the air. The music they'd heard outside was clearer now, a hauntingly beautiful waltz played by an unseen orchestra. "This can't be real," Julia whispered. "How is everything perfect?" Before anyone could answer, they noticed the guests. Dozens of people, dressed in elegant 1920s attire, were mingling and dancing as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Yet something about them felt off. Their movements were too synchronized, their smiles too wide. And none of them made eye contact with the newcomers. "What the hell is going on?" Max muttered. Lisa, ever the fearless leader, approached one of the guests. "Hi there. Can you tell us what's happening here?" The woman she addressed turned slowly, her eyes unfocused. "The clock must strike 12, she said in a hollow voice, before walking away. Lisa frowned. Okay, that was creepy. Meanwhile, Julia had wandered near a large mirror hanging on the wall. Her breath caught in her throat as she noticed something horrifying. The guests' reflections were distorted, their faces decayed and skeletal. She backed away, bumping into Max. "We need to leave, now." The trio regrouped, but their unease grew with every passing moment. Their phones and watches were no longer reliable. Each showed a different time. The mansion's ornate clock, hanging above the grand staircase, ticked slowly, as if mocking them. The guests began to behave more strangely. Their movements became jerky, their whispers louder. And they were all staring at the trio now, their empty eyes following their every move. "This isn't right," Max said. "Let's get out of here." As they headed for the door, an old man stepped in their path. Unlike the others, he seemed lucid, his face filled with fear. He grabbed Max's arm. "You have to leave," he hissed. "Before the clock strikes 12, they'll claim you as their own." "Who?" Max asked, but the man was gone, disappearing into the crowd. Throwing away a life, panic set in as the trio discovered that the front door wouldn't budge. The windows now showed scenes from decades past, parties filled with the same ghostly guests, laughter frozen in time. "We're trapped," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "What do they want from us?" Julia asked, tears welling in her eyes. As the mansion's clock neared midnight, the guests began to close in, their whispers turning into a chant. "Join us. Join us." Lisa grabbed a candelabra from a nearby table and swung it at the nearest ghost. To her shock, the flame burned the spirit, making it recoil. "They're afraid of fire," she shouted. With no time to waste, the trio fought their way to an upstairs window. Max grabbed a chair and smashed the glass. One by one they climbed out, the ghosts reaching for them as the clock struck midnight. They landed in the snow, breathless and terrified. When they looked back, the mansion was dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. "Let's never do anything like this again," Julia said, her voice shaking. As they walked away, Julia reached into her pocket and froze. She pulled out a new invitation, identical to the first. This one read, "Thank you for attending. Until next time." In the distance, faint music began to play from the mansion again. A few years ago, a group of friends decided to celebrate New Year's Eve by doing something different. Instead of going to the usual parties in the city, they rented a cabin in a remote wooded area. It was meant to be a quiet, relaxing way to bring in the new year. Just them, a warm fireplace, and a small stockpile of food and drinks. The group consisted of 5 people: Emily, Jake, Sarah, Matt, and Laura. They arrived at the cabin on the afternoon of December 31st. It was a beautiful rustic place, surrounded by thick woods, with no other cabins or buildings in sight. The snow was falling lightly, and the peaceful atmosphere made it seem like the perfect escape from the chaos of the city. As night fell, the group settled in, playing board games, laughing, and enjoying their drinks. Around 9 p.m., as they were getting ready for a toast, they heard a knock at the front door. It startled them because they hadn't seen anyone else on the road up to the cabin, and it wasn't exactly a place you'd stumble upon by accident. Jake got up to check. He peered out the window next to the door, but didn't see anyone. "Probably just the wind," he joked, but the knock had been deliberate, too steady to be anything natural. Curious, he opened the door. No one was there. Just the cold air and the sound of the wind picking up. The group laughed it off. They chalked it up to one of the many creaks and groans the old cabin made, though the knock had been clear. They shut the door, turned up the music, and resumed their games. About an hour later, at 10 p.m., the knock came again. This time it was louder and more deliberate. It was patient 170 from Ecuador, Blinburn. Matt opened the door without hesitation. Standing there was a man. He looked to be in his mid-40s, dressed in a shabby coat and jeans that were too thin for the weather. His hair was unkempt, and his face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes. "Finally, I've been walking forever," the man said. "Thanks for inviting me." The group exchanged confused glances. No one had invited anyone else, and they certainly didn't know this man. Emily, trying to be polite, spoke up. "I think so too," her assistant agreed, and he glanced at Cairo. "I've already scratched and crabbed to get through it. I think you have the wrong place. We didn't invite anyone." The man's smile faded slightly. "No, I'm sure this is the right cabin," he insisted. "Laura invited me." Laura's face went pale. She shook her head quickly. I don't know you," she stammered. The man's expression darkened. He stared at Laura for a long moment before muttering, "Maybe I made a mistake." Without another word, he turned and walked away into the woods. The group was unsettled. They locked the door and double-checked all the windows. Matt tried to brush it off. "Just some weirdo. He's probably lost." But Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "How did he know my name?" she whispered. No one had an answer. "Idiots!" At 10:30 p.m., another knock. This time, it was violent, almost as if someone was trying to break the door down. When Jake peeked through the window, the man was back, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were wide, unblinking. "Let me in," he demanded. "It's freezing out here." Jake stepped back from the window. Sarah grabbed her phone and called the local sheriff's office, but the dispatcher explained that due to the storm, help might take hours to arrive. The man continued banging on the door, yelling now, "Why are you lying? You invited me. Let me in." The group huddled together in the living room, trying to ignore the knocking. After a while, it stopped, but their relief was short-lived when they heard footsteps circling the cabin, accompanied by scratching noises at the windows. "It's getting late," Pam said, as they heard the windows finally catching open. Emily suggested turning off the lights so it would look like no one was home, but when Matt went to the light switch, the power suddenly cut out. They were plunged into darkness. "It's just the storm," Sarah said, though her voice was shaky. They lit a few candles and sat together in the living room, trying to come up with a plan. Around 11:45 p.m., they heard something new. A low chanting coming from outside. The man was back, but this time he wasn't knocking. He was standing in the snow, just beyond the front porch, speaking in a language none of them recognized. Jake and Matt decided to check the cabin's perimeter. As they stepped outside with flashlights, they discovered strange symbols carved into the deck and trees surrounding the cabin. The symbols looked ancient, almost ritualistic. "What the hell is this?" Jake whispered. Inside, Laura suddenly screamed. The others rushed back in to find her staring at the mirror above the fireplace. She claimed she saw the man's reflection standing behind her, even though the room had been empty. Midnight was approaching, and the tension in the cabin was unbearable. The chanting outside grew louder, and the man began to laugh, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the woods. When the clock struck midnight, the laughter stopped. The silence was even more terrifying. Then, the front door swung open on its own. Snow blew in, and they saw footprints leading into the cabin. But no one was there. The group froze, too scared to move. Then they heard footsteps upstairs. But they were all together in the living room. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered. They grabbed their coats and ran to the car, but it wouldn't start. The same symbols carved into the deck were now etched into the car's windows. The man appeared again, this time standing at the edge of the woods, smiling. "You can't leave," he said softly. In a panic, they decided to run into the woods, hoping to find the main road. But the woods were disorienting, and the snowfall made it hard to see. One by one, the group became separated. By dawn, only Sarah and Matt made it to a road, where they flagged down a passing driver. They explained what had happened and begged for help. When authorities arrived at the cabin, they found it abandoned. There was no sign of Emily, Jake, or Laura. A few days later, Sarah received a text from an unknown number. It read, "Thanks for the invite." It was New Year's Eve, and Claire was preparing to host a small party at her apartment. She had spent the entire afternoon cleaning, decorating, and arranging snacks and drinks. By 6 p.m., everything was nearly ready. Claire lived in a quiet part of the city, and while the apartment complex wasn't the fanciest, it was cozy enough for her and her occasional gatherings. As she was putting the finishing touches on the decorations, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Claire hesitated for a moment, but eventually answered. "Hello?" she said. There was silence on the other end, followed by a single distorted word. 10. Then the line went dead. Claire frowned and put her phone down. It was odd, but she figured it was just a wrong number or some kind of prank. She had too much to do to dwell on it. About 15 minutes later, as Claire was setting out drinks, her phone rang again. It was the same unknown number. This time, when she answered, the voice on the other end said, 9. The distortion made the voice sound inhuman. Before she could respond, the call ended. Claire felt a twinge of unease, but convinced herself it was a coincidence. Maybe someone was trying to prank random numbers for New Year's. Still, she blocked the number just to be safe. By 7 p.m., Claire's best friend Mia arrived early to help with the final touches. Claire mentioned the strange calls, but Mia just laughed. Claire stood in the sink. "It's probably one of your neighbors messing with you. People get weird on holidays," Mia said, shrugging it off. Claire nodded, trying to let it go. With Mia there, she felt a bit more relaxed. But as they worked, Claire's phone rang again. This time it was a different unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" 8, the distorted voice said before hanging up. Claire's unease grew. She showed Mia her phone, but Mia dismissed it again. "They're just changing numbers to get around your block list. You should ignore it," Mia said. Claire tried to take her advice, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By 8 p.m., more guests had arrived, and the party was starting to come alive. Claire felt a bit better with the apartment full of people. The strange calls had stopped, and she convinced herself that it really was just a prank. At 9 p.m., though, her phone buzzed again. This time the voice said, 7. Claire's stomach dropped. She felt as though the voice had grown colder, more menacing. She looked around the room at her guests, wondering if someone among them was playing a joke. But everyone seemed to be having a good time, completely unaware of her anxiety. At 10 p.m., Claire received another call. 6, the voice said, pausing before adding, "Happy New Year, Claire." Her blood ran cold. "Who is this?" she demanded, but the line went dead. She told Mia what had happened, and Mia's expression finally grew serious. "Okay, that's creepy," Mia admitted. Together, they decided to check all the windows and doors to make sure everything was locked. Claire's apartment was on the 3rd floor, but that didn't make her feel any safer. At 11 p.m., Claire's phone rang again. She didn't want to answer, but her hand moved to the phone almost automatically. 5, the voice said. This time, there was a long pause before the call ended. Mia suggested they call the police, but Claire felt foolish. What would she even tell them? That someone was calling her with a countdown? Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. By 11:30 p.m., the party was in full swing and Claire tried to push her fear aside. But just as she was starting to relax, her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to answer, but she knew she had to. 4, the voice said. Then in a low, menacing tone, it added, "I see you." Claire's heart pounded. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning every face. No one seemed out of place, but the voice had sounded so sure, so close. At 11:45 p.m., Claire got another call. 3, the voice said. This time, it described what she was wearing, a black dress with silver earrings. Panic set in. Claire grabbed Mia and a few other guests and searched the apartment from top to bottom. They checked closets, under the bed, even the balcony, but found nothing. At 11:59 p.m., Claire's phone rang one last time. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. "Two," the voice said, followed by a chilling whisper. "One. Look behind you." "Moyestan." Claire froze. The partygoers were cheering and counting down to midnight, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Slowly, she turned around. At first there was nothing, but then the lights went out. The apartment plunged into darkness, and the cheers turned to screams. I had the scent of my own person, and the cheers turned to screams. Someone was moving in the shadows. Claire could hear heavy breathing and the sound of footsteps. When the lights flickered back on, chaos had erupted. People were running for the door, some were crying, and Claire saw a figure in a mask standing in the corner of the room. The mask was plain and white with no features, but the presence was terrifying. When the mask was filled with poltergeist, the masked figure moved swiftly, targeting guests one by one. Claire and Mia managed to hide in the bedroom, locking the door behind them. They could hear the screams of their friends in the living room. By the time the authorities arrived, Claire and Mia were huddled in the corner of the bedroom, too terrified to move. The police found several guests injured, and a few were missing. The masked figure was gone. As Claire tried to piece together what had happened, her phone buzzed one last time. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. The message read, "Happy New Year." The police later discovered a camera hidden in the apartment, pointing directly at the living room. It had been there for weeks, capturing everything. The perpetrator had been watching Claire long before New Year's Eve. Adoption agencies such as ATF and YS placed Claire with a foster family who had traveled to the United States on her wedding plan.